Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another exciting talk from the Oxford Guild and our Collegium Global Network with our partner societies from leading universities. We're delighted to be hosting this special online event today with Yanis Varoufakis, former Greek finance minister and high-profile economist, academic, and writer, as well as the co-founder of the Democracy in Europe movement, DiEM25. In 2018, he launched a Progressive International with former US presidential candidate and Senator Bernie Sanders, and is widely known from his role during the renegotiations of Greece's debt with its creditors during the 2015 government debt crisis. Since then, he's been recognized for his thought leadership on international affairs and economic policy. Varoufakis is the author of several books, and his works include Adults in the Room, My Battle with Europe's Deep Establishment, and Talking to My Daughter About the Economy. Today, he'll be touching on a wide range of issues relating to the latest crises our world faces and resilience, and answering your questions. Thank you very much again, Yanis, for taking the time to join us and share your insights. And over to you. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much about the invitation. Thank you all for registering, for tuning in. I've been asked to give a speech today on resilience. And, to make it a bit more dramatic, the title is Resilience on the Brink. Now, this word has acquired an important significance in the last 10, 12 years. It sounds good, doesn't it? Resilience. I mean, who would not want to be resilient, especially in the face of a shock to her or his system? But please take an important note. This word has emerged as dominant in the economic debates, political and economic debates. It has surreptitiously replaced other words, like, for instance, prosperity or full employment. Once upon a time, when I was your age and studying economics, reading economics in Britain, it was all about full employment. Full employment was the virtue, the aim of macroeconomic policy. Prosperity used to be in the 60s. That was replaced by full employment. And around the time of 2008, the financial crash of 2008, resilience became the buzzword. Well, maybe that's also to do with the fact that the powers that be realized that in 2008 that the world of financialized capitalism was anything but resilient, that the word by which to describe it was fragile, fragility. Now, how resilient has financialized capitalism proved 12 years after 2008, in this year of glory and discomfort, 2020? My hypothesis or proposal to you is that COVID-19 has put the authorities' claims that capitalism has overcome the 2008 crisis and has grown to be at least resilient. It has put those claims to the harshest of possible tests, making a virtue out of necessity and to some extent elevating wishful thinking to the pedestal reserved for reasoned analysis. Many of the establishment, whether they are from the Treasury, the US Treasury Department, the Fed, the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, financial markets, they predicted a V-shaped recovery. That would be, if it eventuated, serious proof of resilience, if there was a V-shaped recovery. Now, is it going to happen? Well, the jury's out, as they say. But my suggestion to you is that even if it does at the aggregate level, if you have a recovery of the indices, GDP, for instance, that follows the recovery of share markets that, by the way, have been doing very well, thank you, despite the collapse of both aggregate demand and aggregate supply globally. Even if this numbers or indices recovery takes place, the question is, will this recovery nevertheless leave behind it or produce greater inequality, more people left, or more precisely held behind, greater discontent, and therefore more poisoned politics, just like 2008 did? Now, there's a lot of optimism that the third quarter of 2020 is going to register a rebound of our economies. And I have no doubt that it will, as people start flocking into the shops. We've already seen that there's going to be a kind of inflation of all those indices that the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal love to report on. So let's assume that this numbers recovery does take place. What happens next? Will the economy continue merrily along with incomes and jobs bouncing back? Or is it going to stay depressed with very low levels of investment, causing therefore a greater surge of xenophobic nationalism and requiring, a break with ongoing policies, something like a Green New Deal or even more radical measures? Now, to assess this question, I read these mainstream newspapers, good newspapers like, the New York Times, the Times of London, the Telegraph, Le Monde in France, and so on. And what I find is a shared mental model that they have. They regard the pandemic as an economic shock, like an earthquake, or like the 9/11 terrorist attacks in New York City. A disruption, like a vehicle hitting a barrier. You have a solid structure, you have an accident, you have a short-term deviation from normal growth, but then the system is solid that it takes it. Now, what they claim, mainstream newspapers in particular, is that to get capitalism moving again, what is mainly needed is confidence, a monetary surplus, a little bit of fiscal expansion. And if this leads to consumers challenging their pent-up demand into new spending, this kind of stimulus, monetary with a little bit of fiscal stimulus, then you're going to have a revival in investment. And all is going to end up okie dokie at the end of the day. That's the V-shaped story. However, this seems to me over-reliant on a model of the world that reflects the 1960s, not the 1990s, the 2000s, and certainly not the 2010s and 2020s. It ignores three major changes in really existing capitalism that have taken place since the 1970s. All those three can be grouped under the term financialized globalization. The rise of services and consumption and employment in the developed countries like the United Kingdom. That's the first development that they don't take into consideration. Secondly, the long supply chains that principally involve China somewhere along the line. And third, the impact of financialization regarding, in particular, personal and corporate debts. Now, if the economies of the West resembled the economies of the 1960s, then maybe the V-shaped story would have been a good one. Maybe resilience would be in place. Because you see, back then, you were not born back then, I was. Our economies were a lot more balanced. Take the United Kingdom. Your country produced goods, both for businesses and households, at every level of abstraction, at every level of technological development and innovation, whether it was cars, tools, food, and all this economic activity involved a very small, in relation to the economy, and a very regulated financial sector. Okay. Broadly speaking, if you looked at the West, the developed countries, they imported mainly commodities, and they exported final goods. Today, the United States in particular produces for the world advanced commodities, very few, very advanced, as well as financial services, and imports almost everything else. To some extent, that also applies to a country like the United Kingdom and some of the countries or economies of the European Union. Consumer demand in the United States was boosted primarily by buying American cars, buying American TV sets, household appliances, and so on and so forth. Right? Today, domestic demand depends a lot more on the things that COVID-19 has hit, like restaurants, bars, coffee shops, tattoo parlors, as well as what you folks are doing, paying fees to go to university. This is another development. And you see that these are the sectors that are not going to rebound, whatever stimulus you have. If you add to this the fact that wages have become largely stagnant since the 1970s, and a lot more so since the 2000s, while a lot of the consumption is based on personal and corporate debts, another dimension comes in, which speaks against the V-shaped recovery story. So mainstream economics and economic writers in the great newspapers, financial newspapers and so on, pay very little attention to this structural shift of our economies. It is as if they're speaking about the 1960s. They forget that demand for American airplanes, Boeing planes, or capital goods, or for the advanced exports of the United Kingdom, like Rolls-Royce engines and so on. They don't depend on domestic conditions, they depend on global conditions. The orders come from abroad. And at current prices, when the oil industry is failing across the world, this means that many of the countries that would be ordering advanced goods from places like the United Kingdom and the United States and the European Union simply can't afford to do it. And that is independent of any stimulus. So, and this is, I think, crucial. We don't just have a collapse of incomes due to the lockdown in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and in the European Union. We have something else, which is even more worrying. Even those Americans, Europeans, Brits, whose income has not been affected by the lockdown, maybe some of them saw their incomes rise. Even they spend less because of the uncertainty, the very radical uncertainty. Meanwhile, across the West, you have an increase in private debts, rents, mortgages, rents. By rents, I mean you have people falling into arrears when it comes to rent, car loan, prepayments, student debt, utility bills, and of course mortgages. So that creates circumstances for automated austerity. That is austerity which is hitting our economies, or will be hitting our economies for a while now, even if it's not a government policy. Yeah? Worse still, because our governments are borrowing so much in order to ameliorate for the effects that I've just been describing, there is no doubt that at some point, politicians of a certain political ilk are going to emerge in control of the Treasury in Britain, of the US Treasury in the United States. They're already in control in the various treasuries of the European Union, planning new austerity. In the European Union, there's no doubt about that. We have something called the Fiscal Compact. It has been suspended during this pandemic, but there's no doubt that it will come back. And the moment it comes back, planned austerity is going to be added to the automated austerity of the present. So we have a structural deflationary process happening, which is not simply a consequence of government incompetence. It is built into the system that we have been nourishing for the last 12 years. In 2008, the economy that evolved since the 1970s, and which I briefly recounted, seemed to be doing really well. It was in rude health. It was creating lots of incomes and lots of wealth. Lots of inequality too, but lots of incomes and lots of wealth. But remember, in the autumn, in the fall of 2008, it proved itself to be a house of cards economy. A house of cards economy that just crumbled the moment the bubble in the financial sector burst. Then immediately our governments, and especially our central banks, refloated the banking sector. They zombified the banks. The banks were undead. They neither were allowed to die, okay, nor was their insolvency. Look at RBS, for instance. You just have to look at the books of RBS or Deutsche Bank, for that matter. Nor did they become healthy again. So they were sort of zombified, kept there. And to keep or to create a semblance of recovery after 2009 in particular, the G20 central banks produced mountain ranges of money, which they pumped into the financial sector of the West, but not all in the West, of the world. That money seeped out of the financial sector and became easy loans for corporations. So in the last 12 years, we've had this very interesting conundrum. On the one hand, corporations were having very low profit rates. Why were they having low profit rates? Because while they were being fed with increasing quantities of cheap money from the central banks, sometimes zero interest rate loans, the many out there, the multitudes, were suffering austerity. In the United Kingdom, George Osborne; in the European Union, the fiscal compact, the Troika, I don't need to say more, but even in the United States, because the Obama stimulus was very short-lived, and also it was cancelled effectively by the austerity of the states' budgets. So the federal government was spending a little bit of money, but the states were saving money, and they were forced to save money because of the collapse of business activity and especially house prices in various places like Miami, California, and so on. So the austerity for the multitudes and the massive financialization funding of the corporates led to a situation where you had companies doing really very well on the basis of cheap loans, but not so much on the basis of profits from selling stuff. In a sense, the zombification of the financial sector transmuted itself and infected the corporate sector. So you had the zombified banks being the conduit through which central bank money shifted to the corporate sector, zombifying the corporate sector. The point I'm making, in a sense, was that COVID-19 was not just a shock to a solid system. It was the shock to another house of cards. It was another pin that pricked the bubble of corporate debt. This time around, the banks are not a problem like 2008 so much. It is every other corporation, more or less, except those that are digital monopolies like Amazon, like Apple, like Google, that managed to emerge from this pandemic crisis even stronger than before. So now we have exactly the opposite of a resilient economy. Now what we have is a situation, just again, let me remind you of this disconnect between share prices that are quite high, financial markets that are doing very well, thank you, and the real economy, which is going from bad to worse. This has created a major antinomy, a paradox which is very painful for the majority of people in a majority of countries, if not in every country. And it is this. We have very high asset prices because of all these monies that have flowed from central banks across the world to financial sectors. Some financial sectors have loaned that money to corporations. Corporations look around at you people, maybe not you personally, but the people out there, they see that most people don't have enough money to buy stuff. So they say, we have these loans from the financial sector. What we're going to do is we're going to take those loans and we're going to buy back our own shares. Why invest when the products that our new production lines will be creating are simply not going to find enough aggregate demand out there? People out there don't have enough money. So what they do is they take the loans, they bid up the share prices in the share market by doing buybacks. Their wages, salaries, if you are a director in the board of directors, is linked to your bonus, is linked to the share price. You're doing very well. But at the same time, no investment means that the many have, soul-destroying jobs to go to, or very precarious jobs. So asset prices beget inequality, which in turn begets at once discontent amongst the many and economic depression. But these high asset prices that are producing all this trouble are crucial to the financing of the corporations, because the corporations get liquidity, borrow money on the basis that the assets, shares, for instance, that they have and which they put up as collateral have high prices. So the high asset prices that create inequality and discontent and depression are also essential to maintain the liquidity to the zombified corporate sector. So it's, we are stuffed if we do, we are stuffed if we don't, if you know what I mean. If you deflate the high asset prices, then the zombies will suddenly die because they won't have access to cheap money. And then millions will become unemployed who work for those zombies. If you don't deflate the high asset prices, then the inequality that these high asset prices produce are going to beget discontent anyway. So this is the reason why we are not in a resilient state of affairs. And what happens next depends on us. This is a failed model. Resilient capitalism is a dangerous fantasy. And the reality that this fantasy propagates and reproduces is one that can only be good for those who want taller walls and better electrified ones separating our different countries, the ones that weaponize the fear of the other, of the foreigner, of the different, and the ones who always manage to exploit an economic conundrum, an economic paradox for the purposes of misanthropy. So we better get organized and do things differently. What does that mean? Well, that's another talk. It's another meeting. And maybe some of those aspects are going to come out in the Q&A. Thank you so much for bearing with me.
Thank you very much, Yanis. A brilliant series of points explained there. I'm sure absolutely no one is surprised that we've had quite a lot of questions coming in. We've left a healthy length of time for a long Q&A. So let's get started with a question from Matthew, doing economics at Oxford. Matthew asks, why do Southern European countries, such as Italy, lag behind their Northern European counterparts so much? What would you suggest to change this?
Well, Matthew, the answer, I think you can expect this coming from me. It comes in a single word, the euro. Think of what was going on before the euro. If you look at growth rates, rates in productivity, and investment before the euro, you would see, if you take Italy and Germany, just for argument's sake, you would see that Italy was catching up. Italy was growing quite robustly up until the euro came. Why is this? It is a fact of nature almost that when you have two countries and one has a greater capital utilization rate than another, in other words, you have larger companies with more machinery, greater productivity, and greater reliance on capital. The greater reliance on capital means that you have greater oligopolistic power, so you can have a greater profit rate for the large companies that rely on capital. Another country like Italy, even though it has an industrialized north that competes in terms of capital utilization with Germany, you have another large segment of the country that has small companies that produce mainly non-tradable goods, and where the price-cost margin is much, much smaller because there's, by definition, more competition. Now, when you join those two countries together by means of international trade, and you have a free-floating exchange rate, then the exchange rate of the Italian higher labor utilization, lower capital utilization rate country, right? That exchange rate slides permanently to keep a balance between imports and exports, to keep the trade account more or less balanced. But when you take the currency of the surplus country, the Deutschmark, and you make it also the currency of Italy, because this is what the euro is. The euro is a disguised Deutschmark. Let's be honest and serious about it. And you lock the exchange rate, and it cannot change. It is a fact of nature. I insist on that. This is not a question of, the management by governments, the will of the people, our spirituality. It's like, the laws of gravity. You cannot argue with them, even if you want to. What happens is every time an industrial robot, let's say, is sold by a German company to an Italian company, to Fiat, let's say, or a Mercedes-Benz goes from Germany to Italy, a wad of euros goes from Italy via the central banking system to the German company. Now, if this is not ameliorated by an exchange rate change so that the competitiveness of Italian exports to Germany is restored, what's going to happen is there's going to be an accumulation of euros in German bank accounts, a lake of euros. That lake will not be, you will not find customers in Germany because the German companies do not want to borrow as much as the Italian companies because they have a surplus. So the German banks will suddenly have an imperative to lend to the Italians because they don't have anyone else to lend it to. And as you know, the worst curse for a banker is to have money that is idle, that is not being lent. But because Italy is a deficit country vis-a-vis Germany, Italy is going to be starved of funding. So they will want the money from Deutsche Bank or Commerzbank. So this perpetuates a situation where you have greater and greater indebtedness of the private sector of Italy to the private sector of Germany. As long as this recycling continues and the German banks send the savings of the German companies, corporations to Italy, what's going to happen is the Italians or the Greeks will be buying the Mercedes-Benz and they will be getting the money from Deutsche Bank in order to buy it. But if at any point there is a credit crunch like there was in 2008, when the banking system, Deutsche Bank, the German banks went bankrupt because of their inane wages placed on United States derivatives based themselves on subprime mortgages in the United States, and suddenly Germany can no longer refinance the loans that it had given previously to Italians. Suddenly Italy cannot refinance its debt, neither the private sector nor the public sector. Then the European Union comes in and says, well, we will lend you the money as long as you practice austerity. So during a recession, which is what? Private sector reducing its expenditure, the state sector has to reduce its expenditure. The sum of the private and the public expenditure is GDP. So these policies of austerity in Italy reduce further economic activity, further investment, and further the tax take of the Italian government. And this is a never-ending circle. The only way to end this is either by ending the euro or by having a recycling mechanism whereby you have a federal government, like what happens in Britain. Because, you know, if Yorkshire and London have the same relationship that Germany and Italy have. The difference between Germany and Italy and Yorkshire and London is that you have a federal government of sorts, you have a national government, and the unemployment benefits in Yorkshire are they're not being raised in Yorkshire. They're raised mostly in the south where the incomes are higher. So that's what keeps England or Britain intact, whereas the Eurozone is fragmented. Too long an answer, I'm sure, but it was a difficult question.
No, it's brilliant. Thank you very much. Another question here from Michael, doing accounting and finance at Warwick Business School. Michael asks, what is your evaluation of the EU's coronavirus recovery plan?
I will tell you when I see it. Because, like, you know, Michael, EU means fantastic propaganda and excellent smoke and mirrors. So what we had was Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, and Macron, the President of France, go together. They had a little love-in, and they came up with a plan. They announced it. Everyone took it for granted that this is what's going to happen. I didn't, because, you know, I've seen this this play before, right? And I was not impressed. So then what happens is, a week or 2 weeks later, the European Commission comes out with a variant of this plan. Everyone comes out celebrating it as if it is, you know, the best thing since sliced bread. It was not. I looked at it. I will explain to you why I was not impressed. But I didn't even go that far because it was just a proposal again. 3 days ago, in the Financial Times, 4 prime ministers, the Prime Minister of Sweden, Austria, Holland, and Denmark, wrote a very, very well authored scripted and argued letter. Not that I agree with them, but it was a very solid piece of reasoning as to why they would say no to this plan. So, allow me to evaluate the recovery plan when they agree to it, not when they talk about it. But nevertheless, suppose that what the Commission came up with, which the 4 prime ministers already explained why they're going to veto it, suppose that this goes through, or some variant of this goes through. What is the problem with that? It sounds fantastic, hundreds of billions. But then if you look very carefully at it, you realize that, as always, Mephistopheles resides in the details. First, this is not real money. It's not real money. This money does not exist. It's not that they have this money somewhere, or they will print it even and give it to Greece, to Italy, to Germany, and so on. What they're going to do is this. The member states that are already more or less bankrupt, right? Because remember, unlike the British state, no EU or Eurozone member state has a central bank behind it, really. They can't do that which Boris Johnson is doing. Boris Johnson is issuing debt and the Bank of England is buying it immediately, off the shelf. That cannot happen in the European Union. Why? Because we decided it won't happen. This is part of the treaties. Silly idea, but nevertheless, this is the state of affairs now in the European Union. So what we've done in our infinite wisdom again is Greece. Now, I'll say this slowly so that you don't fall off your chair. Greece is going to guarantee the new debts of the European Union Commission, along with Italy, Portugal. Yeah? So that our bankrupt governments are going to guarantee Brussels loans that Brussels is going to take out from the private sector. And then Brussels will take this money and give it back to Greece, to Spain. Do you realize what I'm saying? The more you look into it, the more desperate one becomes. And the idea is that more of it is going to go to Greece than it would go to Germany. So there is a degree of redistribution, but through loans again. So first, we have to subtract from the money that you hear, the headline numbers that Greece will take, Italy will take. You have to subtract all the money that Greece and Italy are going to eventually have to repay because they've guaranteed those loans, right? Okay, that's point number 1. Point number 2. Even after all this, there will be some transfer that goes to Italy. There will be some transfer that goes to Greece. This misses the main game. What is the main game? The main game is that we don't have common debt in the European monetary area. We don't have something like the equivalent gilts of the treasury, of the bonds that the British government or the US treasury bills that the American government issue. So we don't have a Eurobond. And they've decided not to have a Eurobond. This would be the time to have it. They decided not to have it. Which means what? It means that this year, let me give you the example of my country, but it's exactly the same with Italy. This year, we're going to have a 15% of GDP public primary deficit, state deficit, which is pretty gigantic. And that would have been okay if we didn't already have 190% of debt to GDP ratio. So we're already bankrupt. So we're now going to add another wad of gigantic debts due to the coronavirus on this already unfathomable mountain of Greek debt, similarly with Italy. Now, this goes against the rules of the monetary union. So what they've done is they have suspended those rules. They've said, this is about time, we will have no rules. But that's not going to go on forever. We know that next year, 2 years from now, the rules will come back. So what happens? Already in last Thursday's Eurogroup meeting, which is a forum which I unfortunately know better than I would like to know, the Eurogroup meeting is going to decide, or no, we have already decided that Greece next year, and I suspect that if that applies to Greece, it also applies to Italy, will have a primary surplus. Now, you don't need to be a giant of economic thinking to realize that to go from minus 15% to a primary surplus, you need to cut your budget deficit within a year by more than 15% of your GDP, of your falling GDP. Now, Osborne's austerity, which was self-defeating and did him a lot of damage, and which damaged the British economy, in my view, unnecessarily. It was a very silly thing to have done in 2010. But what was that? Overall, over a period of 4 years, it was 6%. of GDP over a period of 4 years. Imagine over 1 year, 15% of GDP. That's austerity on steroids, on super steroids. So on the one hand, you have this recessionary tidal wave hitting Europe whenever it is that they impose these new rules again, or the old rules once more. And then you have the puny little recovery fund, which I described as a paragon of financial engineering. Lehman Brothers looks rather virtuous compared to that, to ameliorate. I don't want to say more.
Great. Question from Ariana, doing law at LSE. Ariana asks, recently you had a call with Julian Assange and you discussed how authoritarian leaders will exploit rising discontent. Do you see a shift to even more conservatism and nationalism?
Yes. But it's not conservatism, because, as you know, I'm a radical lefty, but I have friends in the Tory party. And, I have a great deal of respect for conservative ideas, because one has to have respect for the opposition, especially, Edmund Burke, all these ideas about gradualism as opposed to radical change. Even though I'm a radical, I appreciate conservatism. What I fear is not conservatism. I mean, is Boris Johnson conservative? Can somebody tell me this? Because I'm not sure. But nationalism, toxic nationalism, xenophobic nationalism, is winning over, day in, day out. And I very much fear about that. You mentioned my call with Julian. Maybe people know that I'm a good friend of Julian's and one of his supporters, even though I find him intolerable at times. But that's, how friends are. I find most of my friends and family intolerable, but that doesn't mean that I don't love them and I don't, think highly of them. Julian has honored me a number of times now since his incarceration in Belmarsh prison with phone calls. He gets 1 or 2 phone calls every week for a few minutes from a payphone. And when he calls me, it is only because he wants a perspective of what's happening out there. He doesn't want to talk about his case. He doesn't want to, he just wants, because he's completely, 23 hours a day, he's in isolation, which is just pure torture, in my view. And nobody deserves that, especially not Julian. But nevertheless, when he calls, he wants, what do you think? What is your assessment? So the conversation that we are having now, over an hour, we must compress it in the space of 5, 6, 7 minutes before the prison authorities discontinue the call. So, it's a high pressure conversation. And we discussed, you can go into my website and see what we discussed. What I do after the end of those conversations, so as not to forget it, I sit down and write everything down as honestly as I can and put it on my blog post, because it's important for people to know that Julian Assange is not just some figure. He's a real thinking person. And even though he's driven mad by isolation, he wants to have these conversations.
Lovely. Question from Usama, doing medicine at Cambridge. Usama asks, what were the main lessons you learned from your time as finance minister?
Never accept the position of the finance minister of a country that has just went bankrupt and which owes 310 or 320 billion euros to lenders who do not want their money back. How about that for a lesson? No, but beyond that, it's all true what I just told you. But beyond that, what lessons did I actually learn? Well, I have to tell you that I didn't learn anything of genuine significance. What I had imagined was going on was exactly what was going on. The only thing that I have to tell you, and this I can't speak generally about because I only was finance minister for 6 months. They were very intense 6 months, but I didn't get a chance to get into the nitty-gritty of debates in the United Kingdom, in the United States, in China, in India. But I did manage to do that, to get a very, I had a a seat in the room at the high pressure end of the room in the European Union. And I'll tell you one thing I learned. They are technically incompetent in the European Union. The level of debate regarding macroeconomic, finance, monetary issues in the European Union rooms where all the important decisions regarding our economy are made is abysmal. If they were students of mine, I would have failed them, even if they were first-year students. I know this sounds exceedingly arrogant, but it isn't. I can give you examples. We were discussing VAT. Just a simple example, right? I mean, you don't even have to be an economics student. We were discussing VAT, and I was putting forward a proposal for a reduction in VAT, as well as a reduction of corporate tax rates. And this comes from a lefty. So I was a left-wing minister asking for a reduction in taxation, and I had the right-wing, mainstream establishment figures saying, no, you have to increase the taxes. And I was thinking, this is crazy. If you want more of your money back, then surely you want to generate more taxes. Now, in a broken economy like Greece, the only way to generate more taxes is to reduce the tax rates. That's a Reaganite, Thatcherite argument, which in the case of Reagan or Thatcher maybe didn't apply back in the 1980s, but in the case of Greece in 2015 certainly applied. There's no doubt about that. And they said, no, our calculations show that if you reduce, I was talking about a 6% reduction in VAT from 24% to 18%. And they were saying to me, oh no, look, then your tax take from VAT is going to crash by this much. And I said, okay, can you give me the model? Where's the model? And they wouldn't do it. In the end, I put them under a lot of pressure and gave them the model. And they realized that they had inbuilt within the mathematics of the model zero elasticities. You know what zero elasticity means? That if you double the price, you will double the revenue. Or if you halve the price, you will halve the revenue, which is crazy. I mean, if you were a GCE O-level student, I would have failed you saying that. And they had that inside their models. Unbelievable.
Yeah, that sounds pretty bad. Question from Kofi doing maths at Oxford here. Kofi says, oh, nice question. Kofi says, thank you for being an inspiration for so many of us and fighting the good fight for justice. In a time of poor leadership, which world leaders inspire or impress you?
That's a difficult question, isn't it? Look, I'm impressed by a lot of people who are not leaders of note. People out there who are doing incredible work in municipalities here on my island, in Aegina, in Greece, in India, in Kerala, for instance, where they managed to have very good results with COVID-19, much better than New Delhi did, in particular municipalities and neighborhoods in the United States. So good quality leadership exists around the world, but somehow it does not manage to rise up to the top. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is that we live in sordid oligarchies that ensure that only those who serve their interests rise to the top. And the way to keep the good leaders down is through a combination of character assassination and campaign financing. So I won't come up, you probably know, if you know anything about me, you know that I'm good friends with Bernie Sanders. I was a good friend of Jeremy Corbyn. That doesn't mean that either he or I are good leaders. I'm just declaring my friendship with him. I'm very inspired by the Prime Minister of Iceland, Katrín Jakobsdóttir, who is a good friend and with whom we are launching on the 18th of September, or relaunching the Progressive International that Bernie Sanders and I originally launched in November 2018. There are, as I said, highly inspirational people all over the world, but unfortunately we live in regimes that keep the good people out and only tolerate the yes men and some women.
Question from Amara here, doing engineering at Imperial. Amara asks, what do you predict will happen with the Brexit negotiations? Is a no-deal Brexit inevitable? How do you see that impacting the UK and also the EU?
Well, firstly, so that there's no confusion, let me make it clear to anyone who doesn't know about what my position has been. It's always important to know what one's position is before you judge the statement that will come out of their lips. I campaigned against Brexit, not because I am a great fan of the European Union, but because I thought that Brexit would be damaging both to the European Union and to the United Kingdom. And I was campaigning for a major reform of the European Union, which I thought was more likely if Britain stayed in, and if the good people of Britain, who have serious concerns about the lack of democracy and the much of what passes in Europe as propriety ending up becoming exactly the opposite, that they would help bring about the reform of the European Union through a clash. I remember I even said to George Osborne once, why don't we veto the hell out of every decision that comes to ECOFIN until they come up with the right policies? And he looked at me. We don't do that. We just don't participate in anything that's not that concerns Britain. And I thought, well, in that case, we all go down down the drain. Anyway, so that was for the purposes of making clear my stance. What do I think is going to happen? I think there's going to be a deal, which will be a no deal. So there's no such thing as no deal. Whatever it is that is the result of the negotiation, even if failure, is going to be described as a deal. It will be a light deal. It will be a deal that involves, I think, no tariffs, no quotas, but it will mean a border, a hard border, and regulatory checks that will impede trade. If you had asked me 6 months ago, I would have said that maybe Boris Johnson will be forced to take a more nuanced position and even apply for a short extension in order to avoid that kind of agreement, non-agreement that will be presented as an agreement. Not anymore. And the reason I'm saying this is twofold. Firstly, this is a brilliant opportunity for Boris Johnson to cut the ties with the EU as he wants to. I'm not recommending it. I'm simply telling you what I think is going to happen, because the costs of COVID-19 are going to be so high anyway, deal or no deal, just as it is so high everywhere else, that the cost of a no-deal Brexit will be conflated with the costs of COVID-19, and then he can move on. That's point number one. That's, if you want, a slight criticism of Boris Johnson as somewhat less than forthcoming, which is a very mild criticism of Boris Johnson. Now, the second point will be a criticism of the EU. Michel Barnier, the chief negotiator of Brussels, is putting forward the position that Britain cannot have its cake and eat it. If Britain wants a deal with the EU, a proper deal, and access to the single market, then it must abide by the rules of the EU. And that sounds almost convincing, actually convincing, except that it isn't anymore, because the single market no longer exists. COVID-19 ended it. I don't know whether you've noticed, but the other day, the German government bailed out Lufthansa. They just gave them a wad of money, billions and billions and billions. I remember when I was trying to save a couple of puny little Greek enterprises, public enterprises, or private enterprises that were going under with the loss of thousands of jobs in an economy that had no jobs in 2015. All hell broke loose. Brussels came down on me like a ton of bricks that I was violating state aid rules. No, all that now has gone. Anyone that does anything, it's a free-for-all. Now we have a new cartel-like attitude where governments can break the rules of the EU at will. But of course, at will does not mean at will, because some governments have the money to do this, like the German government. Other governments do not have the money to do it, like Spain. Spain cannot save Iberia, even though Iberia doesn't belong to Spain anymore. It belongs to IAG and so on. But nevertheless, you know what I mean. So the stringent rules of the level playing field that Michel Barnier is invoking in order to hit Boris Johnson over the head with they're non-existent anymore. So that, I think, is an argument for Boris Johnson to get out. So I fear that the worst of all possible outcomes is coming, and the worst thing, being a political animal, is that I can't even blame Boris Johnson entirely for this.
Very interesting stuff. Question here from Georgios, doing economics at UCL. Georgios asks, is this the best time to introduce UBI to improve, if not fix, the current state of Western economies and support the weakest people in our societies? Could we afford this?
Yes and yes. Yes and yes. This is the time to do it. Think about it. Our central banks are printing money as if there is no tomorrow. Sometime in March, I sat down and I did a back of an envelope calculation. If the Central Bank of Europe were to give every citizen, resident of the European Union monetary area, of the countries, the 19 countries that use the euro, every citizen, including children and old people and young people and whatever, 2,000 euros, which is a substantial sum of money, right? Something like 1,500 quid. How much would that cost? And the result was my simple calculation reported that the outcome would be 750 billion euros. It's nothing. 2 days later, Christine Lagarde, the president of the ECB, came out, and of course this was complete accident. It was totally by chance that she announced 750 billion of a new fund to buy corporate bonds and government bonds in the share markets, in the money markets. The problem with this is that when the central bank prints money to channel to the people through the banks and the corporate sector, most of it never trickles down to the people. It doesn't. It's what I was saying during my presentation, that what happens is this. The central bank prints money, lends it to Deutsche Bank. Okay, for example. Deutsche Bank is never going to lend it to a poor person who is not going to give it back. It will give it to Volkswagen. Volkswagen takes the money. Volkswagen is not going to build more cars because nobody's buying them. So what will the directors of Volkswagen do with the money they got? They will buy shares of Volkswagen. So not for themselves. Volkswagen will buy back its own shares. Suddenly the share price goes up. That explains why share prices are so high. Okay? But that does not mean investment. It does not mean good jobs. It doesn't mean the money ends there. It goes to the pockets of the directors of Volkswagen, whose bonuses are linked to the share price of. So they, what they do is they buy another apartment in Berlin or in Stuttgart, okay, or an island in the Aegean. They go for almost nothing. I'm sure you could, the Oxford Guild could put some pennies together and buy a Greek island now. Everything's so cheap, right? But that is not creating jobs. It's not creating incomes. The money stops there. It stops with the top 0.1%. So I am all for your suggestion, Yorgo. This is what Georgios sounds like in Greek. As long as it's not funded by taxation. This is where I part ways with many UBI supporters. This is why I prefer to call it, in DiEM25, our movement, we call it a universal basic dividend. This is a dividend. We have to think of it as a dividend. Like, a share owner does not get a wage, does not get an income. They get an income, but it's a dividend. It's a return to capital. So think of our joint enterprise called society as a project that involves all of us, without all of us as consumers, producers, students, innovators, maintainers, providers, doctors, whatever. It wouldn't work. So we'll get a dividend, but it should not be from taxation. Why am I saying that? Because if you tell a working class person in Salford or in, Clacton-on-Sea, I'm going to tax you to give some money to people who are sitting around all day watching television, or to rich people even, that's the universal part of UBI, they will get cross, and rightly so. They can hardly make ends meet. Why should they be giving part of their wages to people who don't work, either because they are rich or because they don't want to? But if you say to them, the central bank prints money anyway, everybody gets a cut. That's very different. Or different. Also, in addition to that, DiEM25 has a policy of saying to large corporations involving more than 500 people, let's say, medium-sized and large, if you want to operate in the country, you will have to give a share of your shares, a part of your shares. You have to deposit them, gift them to a social welfare fund or a social equity fund, and the dividends then are distributed across everyone. Because anyway, these days, social capital it goes into the production of private capital across our economies.
Okay, question here from Sophia, who is a secondary school economics teacher. Sophia asks, how can tourist-dependent economies become resilient without hopping on the fragile financial bandwagon? What sort of restructuring do they require?
Well, we need to be less tourist-dependent. It's really very simple. It's like farmers. If you're a farmer and you have quite large a farm and you have a single crop, you're being very silly. You have to diversify. A monoculture does not augur well. It does not give you resilience in cases of a shock. The situation in Greece is appalling. We have 28% of our GDP dependent on tourism. So you can imagine what's going to happen this summer. And it's also environmentally catastrophic. If you take a Greek island, given that I am speaking to you from a Greek island, the island I am here at, once upon a time, was more or less autarkic. Once upon a time, it was producing the food that people ate. It was capable of producing the water that people drank or used in various activities. More stuff was coming out of this island, going to the mainland in terms of produce that was being exported than stuff coming in. Today, as we speak, because of reliance on tourism, all the water has been depleted, and so it comes in either through pipelines or water tankers. Supermarkets are stuffed with things that come from Germany, from Morocco, and so on and so forth. So it's also a question of sustainability. So it's macroeconomic resilience and environmental reproducibility. So I'm not saying that we should go to zero tourism, no, but we should move away from destructive tourism. We should reduce reliance on tourism. There are other places too, because if everybody comes to our island, then they don't have much of a good time, right? So, tourists should spread out a bit more across the world. They should be less reliant on very cheap alcohol-based, especially the British or Swedish holidays. And it should be done sustainably. When you come to my island, I would like you to be able to taste foods produced on this island, not imported from, by a German company from Morocco. If you want to eat Moroccan stuff, go to Morocco to eat it. Don't come to Egina. This is the simple point.
Great. Great answer. A question here from Priya, doing geography at KCL. Priya asks, how should governments best balance the need to save lives and the need to resuscitate the economy? What do you suggest is the best approach against COVID-19?
Well, I think that was always a false trade-off. Either we save the economy or we save people. Look at Sweden. They tried to save the economy by being very light in terms of the lockdown. The result was they had the highest death rate in that neck of the woods, and their economy was not saved. And especially if you have a second and third wave, your economy will be even more decimated. We knew this from the Spanish flu of 1918. We knew that the towns and regions and counties in the United States, from extensive studies carried out there, we know that the counties in the United States that had an early and complete lockdown in 1918 are the ones that recovered far more quickly and whose economic prospects were better in 1920. So that is a false dilemma. It's a false dichotomy. It's a false trade-off that we should never have. What is the best approach against COVID-19? Massive investment in public health and a war economy-like response by the state. Not just giving money away, but organizing also supply chains. making sure that the things that people need, not necessarily the luxuries and stuff, not necessarily, not at all luxuries and all the things that we may want but not necessarily need, they should be provided for in exactly the same way that the British state and other states in the 1940s provided during the war economy. Markets were suspended, and the state made sure that the people that could not fend for themselves were provided for in a spirit of solidarity. That would have been the best way of dealing with COVID-19.
Very interesting. Question here from Alex, who's studying AI in Oxford. Alex asked, in your book, Talking to My Daughter, you spoke about the likelihood of a significant number of jobs being taken over by robots and AI. Has the pandemic accelerated this?
I have no doubt that it has, and it will, because robots, do not catch COVID-19. They're not, they don't shut down when there is a pandemic. But that's not enough for capitalism to recover. And the reason is that it's twofold. The first reason is that while there is no doubt a wave of new artificial intelligence-based machines taking over many of even white-collar jobs from humans, at the very same time, you have the dehumanization and conversion into machinery of human beings. So think of the service sector, which relies on Deliveroo riders. If you go to Bangladesh, for instance, or other countries, in developing countries, you'll find that you have a parallel development. Some factories stuffed with robots producing stuff. So AI, automation, replacement, and displacement of human labor. But then you have other industries nearby that use large numbers of people in a dehumanizing way, operating like machinery. So COVID-19 is definitely going to accelerate the use of artificial intelligence, but it's not going to ameliorate for the fact that we have a system that relies on very cheap and cheapened labor.
Interesting question here from Gabriel, doing history at UCL. Gabriel asks, do you view big data and targeted ads as a net positive or net detractor to or from European democracy?
Look, I am simultaneously a tech enthusiast and a tech skeptic, and I think that's not a bad combination. I couldn't do without the gadgets that my phone and my laptop and my watch provide me with. At the same time, I think that we face very, very serious dangers. We have already become a very interesting form of proletarian, in the sense that in the old-fashioned word of the word proletarian, somebody who only appears in the production process as a product and not as a subject. Already Facebook, Google, and so on treat us like this. Already they capture our attention through various media, capture our attention in order to sell it on to, as data, as big data. And that is a very worrying trend. COVID-19 is making things far worse. Why? Because we are so worried about our health or the health of our loved ones that we are prepared to tolerate magnificent reductions in privacy and human rights as various applications are coming up and used by the state as a result of joint ventures between big tech and state governments, especially in countries that are less known for their concern for liberalism and democracy. To give you a simple example that I gave in an article I wrote recently, if a company were to come up with a bracelet that you wear and it monitors your coughs and monitors your temperature and your blood pressure, and it's connected to your phone, and the phones are all connected to one another, and let's say that this app can very accurately predict whether you are suffering from COVID-19 or whether you have it or not, and that would be very useful. I mean, who would say no to this? Because it would allow you to it will warn you against, if you turn right at this junction, you will probably end up somewhere where there is a high concentration of people with a high probability of infecting you, right? And that would reduce the rate of infections. It would be a good thing to have. But such a technology that monitors our coughs, also monitors our laughs. If it monitors our blood pressure in response to some virus, it can monitor our blood pressure in response to some advertisement on television, to the Queen's speech or the Dear Leader speech in Korea or here in Greece, where we're moving rapidly to the right. And this is not a society I want to live in, where a health emergency can lower our defenses as a people, as a polity, to indefensible, illiberal systems of surveillance and control.
Slightly scary prospect, that. Question here from Vasilis, doing health and data analytics at Imperial. Vasilis asks, what is your take on what would be an appropriate reaction to home-based, unregistered and or unpaid work being normalized by this state of emergency?
Well, that's an easy one. It's happening and I'm appalled. It's very easy when you have isolated people working at home to exploit them. Even during the Industrial Revolution in Britain, there were women who were sent home from the factories, textile factories, for instance, and dressmaking companies. They were sent home with some equipment, and they were asked to produce at home and to deliver their output, and they would be paid by the unit of output, piece rates, they were called. And that was the worst kind of exploitation, because you individuate workers. There is no way that they can combine forces in order to bargain together collectively. You have them in isolation, which has an impact on their on their psychology, on their mental state. This normalization of the state of emergency in terms of working people is a double-edged sword, because some of us enjoy working from home. I do. But I think, yet again, as in almost every other realm of life, it comes down to choice. And for choice to be authentic and genuine, you must have alternatives. But it's very difficult to legislate for alternatives. I have alternatives. I don't have to be working here from home. I could be doing all sorts of other things. But who is to judge whether a worker has a sufficient range of alternatives such that her choice or his choice to stay at home and work under particular contracts or contractual arrangements is genuinely a free choice, and not one that reflects the dictum free to lose?
Yanis, I'm going slightly conscious of time, so thinking maybe two more questions from here. Okay, brilliant. So second last question here from Marta, doing management at Warwick. Marta asks, what impact does intensifying social polarization in Europe have on the COVID-19 recovery measures?
Well, so far, the fear of the pandemic has meant that the first phase went rather smoothly. Social polarization did not translate, at least in Europe, into more discontent, or at least visible discontent. But I very much fear that the second phase is going to be different, especially if there is a second wave that gives authorities cause to lock us down again. I think that is when your question, Marta, is going to become more prevalent and more pertinent. In the United States, we've seen that social polarization has intensified, the anti-vax movement, the anti-lockdown movement, along the lines of previous support for the Tea Party, for Donald Trump. We haven't had that in Europe yet, and I hope we don't.
Okay, thank you very much. Last question here now from Anna, doing physics at MIT. Anna asks, or says rather, you've been an inspirational role model for many like me who'd like to see you back in the cabinet. Who were some of your inspirations or people you looked up to when you were growing up?
Oh my goodness. Well, thank you for a start, but I can tell you I would only go back into a cabinet which does not comprise people who are desperate to compromise in a way that leaves them compromised and leaves our people, the people who put us there, worse off. What were my inspirations? Look, I'm not going to say anything that is completely out of the ordinary. Maybe mention some of the people that wouldn't come immediately to your mind. I was always fascinated by people like Democritus in ancient Greece, who did not follow the beaten path of metaphysics, and he had a very prescient view of the material world. Spartacus in ancient Rome, who decided that it is possible to imagine a world without slavery, and that slavery is not a natural condition. But my greatest heroes are people from the arts, really, from music, theater, Sophocles, Shakespeare, Goethe, Verdi, and so on and so forth.
Fantastic. So on that note, thank you very much, Yanis, again, for sharing your time and insights with us in what has been another enormously interesting and topical session. Thank you also to everyone watching and for all your questions. We look forward to welcoming you all again soon at our upcoming events, and hope you have a good evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great pleasure. Thank you, boss. Thank you all.